Hi, everyone. Dr. Adriana Popescu here with you today on World Mental Health Day. Wanting to share a different perspective, maybe challenge the current paradigm that we seem to have around this idea of mental illness and pathology and disabilities. This is terminology we've been using for a long time in the field of psychology, psychiatry, Western medicine. I'm really speaking to that perspective where the whole idea is to figure out what's wrong with someone and then to do some sort of intervention to reduce the symptoms of that condition, what they would call an illness or a disorder, and to help the person cope better with those symptoms so that they can function in life. And sure, there's value in looking at things that way, but I don't find it to be very empowering. I see myself as an empowerment coach. So much of what I'm doing with my clients, whether I am addressing an issue like depression or anxiety, trauma, addiction, whatever it might be, or maybe I'm working with people in a more coaching kind of framework where we're looking at blockages to achieving goals and things. It always comes back to, I think it always comes back to your point of view creates your reality. So much of what we believe about ourselves, the negative things we believe about ourselves, the negative things we say to ourselves, these harsh inner critics that we have, so much of that seems to be the underlying driver of a lot of the pain and suffering that people go through. Now, in my commentary here, by no means am I trying to minimize the biological aspects of any kind of condition, because absolutely, depression, anxiety, trauma, all of those things have physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual components. They do. And it may very well be that to treat one of those conditions, to begin to heal, actually is a better word I'd like to use, a better phrasing. To begin to heal from those conditions, we really do have to look at all of those aspects. And sometimes medications or physical interventions might be necessary to assist someone in beginning to heal from whatever it is they're struggling with. Part of my story and how I got into these more holistic perspectives, I didn't know anything about holistic healing modalities. I didn't even know I had a body from the neck down, because early in my life, I was so in my head. In fact, this was a brilliant strategy that I developed early in life to cope with what were some difficult circumstances in my early life. I was very intellectual. I was good at school. I was a thinker. And so I learned that you can kind of think your way basically out of anything. You could like solve a problem. You could figure out what's wrong, which is, again, is this very Western perspective. You can figure out what's wrong and then do something to change it. And I also did come from a tradition, having grown up with a father as a medical doctor, where the doctor is the healer, right? The doctor has some sort of power or knowledge or ability to make the patient feel better. And I hate that terminology, patient, actually, because it feels like there's that power differential there. When we use the word client, it has less of that sort of um, patronizing kind of perspective. The traditional, I know things are changing in medicine, and thank goodness. I do think some of that arrogance that we maybe have seen in doctors, I have all the answers. And let me tell you this, this happened to me as I go on in my story. If the doctors don't have the answers or can't figure it out, oftentimes they'll blame shift onto the client, the patient in this case, if we're talking medicine. It's the patient's fault. In fact, I was even told when I got really sick, so that's the next step in the story. When I got really, really sick after college, I was living in Colorado. I just started feeling really sick. I started getting depressed. I didn't know what was happening with me. In fact, it took Western medicine 13 years to give me a proper diagnosis of Lyme disease. I I had doctors telling me it was all in my head and it was all psychosomatic. That I didn't have a real diagnosable condition because they couldn't figure out what it was. So blame the patient. Yeah, that's not real. What you're experiencing is not real. What I was experiencing was very real. It was very debilitating. I got so sick. I became allergic to everything in my environment. I had to give my beloved cat away because I couldn't even be around him because I would get so sick with these allergic reactions. I couldn't be outside for more than 5 minutes before having just massive attacks, fatigue, pain, everything. Like by the time I finally got to a doctor who knew what he was doing, I was I was I had the biological markers when they like did a lot of testing to look at like how my body is functioning. At age 29, I had the biological markers of a 69-year-old. I don't think, in fact, had I not discovered alternative holistic therapies at that time, I actually don't think I'd be with you right now talking. I don't think I'd still be here because Lyme disease can and does kill people. So I was told once I did get a final diagnosis, that you're never going to heal from this. You'll always have this in your system. And the best you can do is learn how to manage it. And I think even back then I knew that that was some level of BS and that I was not going to suffer like this for the rest of my life. I had seen my mom suffer with autoimmune conditions herself. And she was really debilitated. She spent a majority of her time in bed, unable to really function. And I wasn't going to be that. I was not going to walk in her steps. And then nor was I going to be like my father, who died of cancer at a very young age. So I sought out other therapies. I started with chiropractic, acupuncture. My acupuncturist learned a modality called NET, neuro-emotional technique. That really started bringing in the emotional aspects, the energetic aspects of things. And as I started to heal through some of my own traumas, early life traumas, and as I started to look at how I was, what I was doing with energy, what I was doing as a highly sensitive empathic person is I was taking on the energies of like everyone else to the detriment, of my own body, what couldn't handle all that energy of the people around me. And as I started, I eventually made my way to California and to graduate school and started working, in internships and things with clients and was taking on all their pain and suffering. And all of that was too much for my system. So I had to learn how to manage my energy and the energy around me, not taking it in. And I had to heal through a lot of the old negative experiences that I had had. And of course, with those came limiting beliefs. I had limiting beliefs that, I had to do it all on my own, that I was all alone in the world. And I had to be some sort of superwoman and just push through everything. And as I started working with these more holistic therapies, I discovered energy psychology at some point in graduate school. And that was incredible. And so as I started working through my own personal shadow material, I started getting better with my Lyme disease. And the interventions I was using, which were more holistic, they were homeopathic, they were herbs, they were, these types of treatments. My body started to get stronger. My system started functioning better and I started to heal. And so what I can say is after 17 years of struggling with Lyme disease, chronic fatigue syndrome, and all these like other co-occurring conditions that come with it, I am Lyme disease free and I no longer suffer from that disease. So this idea of the disease model, the illness model, I challenge it because I myself went through something and was told that this was basically, it's almost like a fatal condition, right? Like I'm going to have this the rest of my life. There's nothing I can do to change it. And I call bullshit on that because I did change it. And bringing that perspective then to the world of psychology, to therapy, people, let's take PTSD as an example, right? People who've had some really traumatic experiences and lacked the ability to cope with them in the moment might develop lingering effects of that trauma that can show up as something called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And what I started realizing as I was working with clients around healing from PTSD, which really means having to open up Pandora's box and go into all that material that you couldn't cope with at the time, but now revisiting it and you decided you couldn't cope with it and I can't go there and I'm the belief that comes with trauma is like, this is overwhelming, I can't cope with this, I have no power, these really negative core false beliefs, because they're not actually true, that really stop people from being willing to be present with the pain, the memories, and all the things. And so, what I was seeing a lot working in addiction treatment was that people would self medicate their trauma and their pain with drugs and alcohol. So, as you actually create a safe space and you give clients tools to manage emotions, to be able to identify emotions, sit with their emotions, and be able to work through them, which the energy psychology tools and DBT and all of those things are really helpful as you teach people how to also work with their nervous systems, right? Because the person has PTSD is stuck in a fight, flight, freeze response. And that is a normal response, right? That's the thing with so many of these diseases. We're calling them diseases, but a lot of times they're adaptive strategies to surviving painful things. So your body will engage in a fight, flight, freeze response to save your life. If you are being attacked, if you're being hurt in some kind of way, that's what's supposed to happen. But the problem is people don't come out of that, or because it happens over and over and over again. And when you're dealing with like chronic abuse, trauma, whatever, multiple experiences, your brain's, it changes the way your brain functions, and your brain loses its ability, the amygdala, you lose your ability to differentiate. The amygdala no longer can recognize what's actually a threat and what isn't. So people are having these like full blown panic attacks and fight, flight, freeze responses to situations that really aren't life or death, like getting up and speaking in front of a crowd, right? People have like a full blown panic attack. They think they're going to die. Their brain and body think they're going to die, and they're not. Or they're running late for something, or their partner's upset with them, or whatever it is, and they're having these massive overreactions. That's a dysregulated nervous system, right? That's not a disease. That is a condition that needs to be addressed, and you can address it physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. But when you do, and you give a person tools to regulate their nervous system and they start to feel safe, that's when healing can occur. It can't occur if you're still obviously in an abusive situation. It can't occur if you don't feel safe. But and you can talk to doctors about this. There is no pill to fix PTSD, right? I have a psychiatrist friend who told me that. She's like, we don't really have good medications to address the symptoms of PTSD because it isn't a disease. It is a response to overwhelming situations that you could not cope with in the moment that it happened. And so as I started learning more about how to work with trauma in these more mind, body, spirit approaches, particularly through energy psychology and later brain spotting, which came from EMDR, what I realized was that, in fact, if you give people tools to deal with the dysregulated nervous system, which can show up as trauma responses, where people get triggered, by a certain stimulus, like a memory, an intrusive memory or flashback comes up, or maybe they are driving past a place and something bad happened there. That happened with me with car accident. I have multiple car accidents, and every time I drive past that spot on the freeway, my whole body would, have a trauma response. But when you give people tools to downregulate their nervous system, to restore a sense of calm, and when you do the deeper processing of those experiences, like I had to do with my early life traumas, when you work through them in a safe space, usually with a trained professional or healer of some sort, the energy of that trauma gets released. Your body's no longer holding on to it, because that's what happens. The trauma gets stuck in your body. And then the person is able to feel okay. And they don't continue. There's this thing in trauma treatment called memory reconsolidation. You're actually changing as you work through that trauma in that safe kind of way. Your brain, your hippocampus is registering, oh, we're encountering that same dangerous situation, the memory of it and the feelings around it. And we're okay. We're safe. And so that changes your whole relationship to that past experience of trauma. You no longer start to see that trauma as something overwhelming. I can't cope with it. I'm powerless over it. And your narrative around it can change. And that's where, in this case, with unresolved trauma, you move from an active condition of, let's say, PTSD or an acute stress response, to one of post-traumatic growth, where you can come out the other side and say, wow, that was a really horrible experience, but I'm okay now. I'm safe now. I survived it. And in fact, this is where it even starts to get a bit more spiritual. I am actually now able to thrive, and I'm able to live a fuller, more fulfilling life. And maybe I had to go through this experience, this really painful experience, to get there. And I wouldn't be who I am today had I not gone through that painful experience. And that's really where I got to with my Lyme disease. Like, I don't look back on it and think, oh God, I wish that had never happened, which I did for a good portion of while I was in it. I wish this wasn't happening to me. But in retrospect, I can absolutely see that had to happen, or else I wouldn't be talking with you here today. I wouldn't have learned what I needed to learn to be able to facilitate healing for others. And notice I didn't say cause healing for others. I don't do the healing, right? I'm a catalyst. I'm a midwife for the birthing of healing. You're the one doing the labor. I'm just there to support. But this idea, that we can empower people with these modalities to heal from these different conditions, rather than saying, here's a pill or here's a thing, I don't know, a tool of some kind, and the best you're going to do is manage it. Good luck to you. I just don't buy that. And you can look all across medicine and find all kinds of stories of people having cancers and, I don't know, being told they'll never walk again, or whatever it is, this diagnosis, this label they've been given. And yet they're able to somehow, through their own internal process, and probably with a lot of outside support, they are able to move through that and get past it. And so, to give you some other examples, still with PTSD, there have been a number of studies done in the world of energy psychology. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in this, to check out the ASEP website. ASEP is the Association for Comprehensive Energy Psychology. And their website is energypsych.org. So the ASEP website is a great resource for all things related to the research. They have a whole page dedicated to it. And there have been over 350 published research studies about energy psychology and how effective it can be for different conditions. The research is generally very powerful, at least equivalent to what gold standard CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, shows. In fact, a lot of times, I think the data for EFT, for example, tapping on acupuncture points as a treatment for different psychological conditions, outperforms CBT. Most of the time, it's at least equal, if not outperforming it. And the one difference that you see over and over again is that energy psychology can get there a lot quicker. But there's all these studies where they work with people who have had PTSD, and really bad, like veterans who've been through war and combat and all kinds of military trauma. And then another example I'm thinking of is a study that they did with the orphans of the genocide in Rwanda, who had witnessed, unimaginable horrors with watching their families and loved ones being killed. What they did was they would come and work with these folks who had had these horrific experiences and met the criteria for a PTSD diagnosis. And then they would do tapping with them, right? They would do EFT or TFT, thought field therapy. That was the original tapping modality that Dr. Callahan came out with in the late 70s, early 80s. And over a series, for the veterans, I believe it was a series of 6 sessions. And for the Rwandan orphans, it was 1 session of tapping while thinking about that trauma, right? And then creating a sense of safety in the body by stimulating acupuncture points, because what we now understand that does from the Western perspective is when we are tapping on those acupuncture points, we're sending electrical signals through the fascia up to the brain, to that very part of the brain I told you about before, the amygdala. The amygdala regulates your fight, flight, freeze response, okay? So you're sending a signal when you're tapping, and acupuncture works the same way if you're using needles. You're saying to the brain, hey, we're safe and it's okay to relax and get back to that calm state, right? And if you do that while at the same time thinking about the trauma and the fear and the horror and the anger and the rage and all the things that came up around that experience, that's all that energy that's still held in the body, right? It allows you not only to release that energy, but allows you to restore that calm. And then the memory reconsolidation piece changes your memory of it. So basically, this is how we now work with healing PTSD, right? And so what you see is that, after 6 sessions, these veterans no longer meet the criteria for PTSD, according to the VA standard, right? And whatever modalities they're using, the exposure therapy, it takes them at least 18 sessions to get that effect, if they even get that effect. I've actually worked with a lot of veterans who have had that exposure therapy and only found it re-traumatizing because they're just telling their story over and over again. Because they're not really working with the body to regulate this adaptive survival mechanism. Okay. And so, and with the Rwandan kids, 1 session of tapping, and I think it was 86% of them no longer met the criteria of PTSD. And not only that, they go back a year later, they find that something like 68% of those kids maintain their gains after 1 session. And with the veterans, I don't know, they did a follow-up also, and they find that people maintain the gains. For the majority of people do. So this is really powerful stuff. And obviously I've been talking about PTSD and challenging this idea that it's a disorder, it's a disease, you'll be stuck with it for the rest of your life. I just don't buy it to be true. We also pathologize other things like autism, ADHD, all that. And in that arena, we've made some headway. The whole neurodivergence movement has really been very powerful in reframing how, instead of looking at these things as pathologies or disabilities or disorders, that what if it's just a difference in how the brain functions? A person who has ADD or ADHD has a brain that works differently. And so they're not going to learn in the same way. You can't put those kids in a school with other kids and expect that they're going to learn. They're going to be able to sit still. I mean, I don't know who can. I don't know about you, but I had a hard time sitting still. I still do. If I'm in a workshop even, I can't just sit there passively and listen and stay focused on what someone's saying, especially if it's not very interesting. I have to be multitasking. I have to be on my phone. I have to have something to do with my hands, or I need to be engaged in conversation or exercises in learning. That's how I learn best, right? Does that mean I have ADHD? I don't know. I probably could tick a lot of those boxes off. Do I see that as a disorder? No. It's just how do I harness this capacity? And what if it is that? What if it's a capacity? Because I'm looking right now on my computer and I see 50 tabs open at the top. Maybe some of you can relate to that. And that's just one window. I have 5 other windows with 50 tabs each open. And I know what's in each one of them. And I can click back and forth between them because I'm too impatient to wait for one page to load, and I'm working on this. And my brain can multitask, 10 projects at a time. Is that a disorder? Should I be taking medication for that to slow me down? Right? So this idea that mental illness is something that is this stigmatized, shameful, because there's all this, right, negative. Oh, I have this, I am this. When people take it on as an identity, I'm bipolar, I am depressed, I am traumatized. Like, when you say those things, then you take on that identity and all of that disempowerment around, okay, well, that means I'm lesser than other people. I'm not good enough. I'll never amount to anything. I'll never succeed in life because I have this thing, this disorder, this thing. How much do you let that stop you? Because your point of view creates your reality. What if, what's right about having that condition? What if it's trying to show you something? My Lyme disease was showing me how I could heal myself, and I was able to. And that was hugely empowering. And when I give these people these tools to calm their nervous system or to shift, the energy psychology tools are also really good to shift those limiting beliefs, right? If or to change the way you're feeling, I'm feeling really upset, and you're able to calm yourself down, then you become the master of your own healing. You are able to do that. Now, I'm not saying you need to do that on your own in a vacuum. I highly recommend working with trained professionals, but empowering yourself to heal and no longer be identified with a certain label. I don't identify myself as having Lyme disease. I don't identify myself as somebody who has PTSD or ADHD or whatever. No, I'm somebody who has survived difficult circumstances and is now functioning and thriving because I was able to heal the energies and shift the energies of what was creating these imbalances that made it really hard for me to function. So that's my invitation to you, is to reconsider how you might be looking at this, not discounting other perspectives. They all have their place. And there are, like I said in the beginning, there are many, many tools, including medication, that can be very helpful in one's journey of healing. But please do not give up hope or think you are doomed to suffer for the rest of your life with whatever it is you're dealing with, because you don't. And if you want to find out more about how you could do that, obviously continue to check me out here on the socials. But I have my own private practice and group practice, Adriana Popescu and Firebird Healing. We'll put the websites in the show notes. So used to doing my podcast. Put them in the comments here, adrianapopescu.org and firebird-healing.com. You too can heal from whatever condition it is that has been creating pain and suffering. And what if you created that in order to facilitate your own growth and evolution? So if you want to find out more, don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you. In honor of World Mental Health Day, may you have much brilliant, happy, joyful, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health. Thank you.